Tonight on Newshour, a major shift in Britain's democratic landscape. The voting age in England and Northern Ireland is set to be lowered to 16. Well, the government says it's about fairness, inclusion and aligning with Scotland and Wales, where young people already head to the polls at 16. But critics argue the timing is deliberate and political. Well, the electoral overhaul also includes automatic registration and a wider list of acceptable voter ID, all part of what ministers describe as modernising the vote. But opponents warn these reforms raise questions about maturity, manipulation, and whether today's announcement is truly about engagement or advantage. Supporters insist young people are engaged, informed, and already trusted with major decisions in other areas of life. Detractors say the change risks politicising education and exploiting social media influence. With the next general election due by 2029, this reform sets the stage for a markedly different electorate. Is it a bold step then towards greater inclusion, or a calculated move to shift the political balance for years to come? We begin with this report.
British newspapers on Friday morning, July 18th, led with the government's move to lower the voting age by 2 years to 16 in all UK elections. The reform is a major overhaul of the country's democratic system that immediately split opinion over whether they should or would cast ballots. The proposed changes were designed to boost participation and trust in the electoral system, which suffered its lowest turnout at the last national election in 2024 since 2001. It would also align voting rights across Britain, where younger voters can already participate in elections to devolved parliaments in Scotland and Wales, but under 18-year-olds are barred from voting in elections to the British Parliament. The change in Britain will require parliamentary approval, but it should pass, given the policy was part of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's election campaign last year, which gave him a large majority. Despite that large win, Starmer's popularity has fallen sharply in government after a series of missteps set against a difficult economic backdrop. His party sits second in most opinion polls behind Nigel Farage's right-wing Reform UK party.
OK, let's cross live now to our correspondent Olly Barratt in London, who's been tracking the reaction in Westminster. Olly, good to see you. How is Parliament responding to this expansion of the electorate then? And when is it expected to actually take effect?
Well, Guy, there's been a wildly different reaction to this story, depending on who you listen to, of course. Now, when it comes to the political reaction, you have the government saying that this is exactly the right thing to do, to increase democratic engagement, to level up the way in which young people can vote in different elections in different parts of the UK and in different types of electoral event in the UK. The government is saying if you are old enough at 16 to, for example, work and pay taxes, then you should be old enough to vote and have a decision, be involved in a decision on where those taxes go and how they are spent by a government. The Conservatives say that the government position on this is confused. They say there are lots of things you can do between the ages of 16 and 18, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be able to vote. And they say there are lots of things you can't do between the ages of 16 and 18, for example, buy alcohol legally. And so they say that the explanation that the government is giving here doesn't quite make sense. Reform at UK, considered by many a right-of-centre political party led by the Brexit supporter Nigel Farage. He says that his party is against this move for slightly different reasons. And he says it's not about young people potentially voting more likely to vote for the Labour Party. He says that reform has a great deal of engagement with young voters. But he says, for example, if you can't stand as a candidate in an election at the age of 16, he doesn't think you should be able to vote in an election. So he's also pointing to the inconsistency here, the perceived inconsistency. The Liberal Democrats say they are all for this reform. The only thing that they are calling for is for the government to go further and bring in a system of proportional representation here in the UK. That is not something that is likely to happen any time soon. The press, also different reactions to this. Some in the right-wing media are saying they don't believe that 16-year-olds have the information, have the emotional intelligence perhaps yet to vote when they are that young. There are some in what might describe themselves as the progressive media who say that they think this is fantastic for engagement with democracy, to get young people involved earlier in the decision-making progress, may well make them more engaged throughout their lives at a time when many Western democracies are trying to make sure that engagement is on the up rather than on the way down. So this is very controversial indeed. The biggest change to the UK electoral system since the 1960s, when voting in terms of age came down from 21 to 18. The government has been asked about the timing. Why now? Because this was something that was in the party's election manifesto before the last election, but then it wasn't in the King's speech, which sets out the government's priorities for the parliamentary terms ahead. That led to many thinking that perhaps the government had quietly dropped its plans to bring the voting age down to 16. There are some critics of the government who say perhaps this is linked in some way to the fact that Labour are doing so badly in the polls and might want to see if there are ways that they can boost the turnout of a potential Labour vote. That is something that the government denies is taking place. But when it comes to the timeline for all of this, the government says it's confident that it can get this legislation through and fully approved well before the next general election, which has to be held by August 2029, but could be held earlier if the Prime Minister called an election before then. So, Guy, this is, as I say, a major change to the UK's electoral system, and one that is, for many reasons, controversial.
Olly, thank you very much indeed. Well, my first guest is Phil Churn, a political commentator joining us from Devon in the UK. Phil, great to see you. Thanks for being with us on the show, as always. Opponents say this has been driven by short-term political gain. Supporters say this is very much about the democratic principle. We heard Olly there pose the question of why now. Why do you think this is seen as the right moment for this change?
Well, I mean, it was an election promise, of course, and cynically, Labour does need to be seen to be keeping at least some of its manifesto promises. It's gone through a pretty tough year. It's been criticised heavily on welfare changes, on immigration, on the way in which it's been dealing with the Middle East. And so here's something that it can actually do. It's had a lot of the things that it hasn't managed to be able to do have led to criticism within its own ranks, and even left to some people being suspended, some people actually being voluntarily leaving the group. As for this political gain, the jury is still out on that one, because although history would suggest that younger people are more likely to vote Labour, in recent years there's been a little bit of a shift on that. So people between the ages of 16 and 18 now increasingly show a lot more interest in what might be seen as being the new left. So, for example, the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and one of the former Labour rebels, Zara Sultana, are in the process of trying to set up a new left-wing party. There's already been quite considerable support among young people from that. They get support from the Greens as well. But one way in which Labour, this might backfire quite badly on Labour, is that young voters, particularly male young voters, research is showing, is that there's support for reform, the Reform Party. So the issue is can you do this? If you want to be able to make it effective as a political tool in the next general election, there's going to have to be considerably more focus on youth issues, on education, on employment and things like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Phil. So not as perhaps clear cut as people might have thought. And yeah, very interesting that also some support for Reform, the right-wing party, amongst that group too. Let's just have a look at some of the arguments that are put forward, predominantly by right-wing groups in the UK against this initiative, against this development. I mean, some of the studies that have been cited do appear to be reasonably robust scientific studies, albeit possibly slightly out of context. There have been people talking about the fact that the way in which teenagers make decisions is more emotional than rational up until the age of sort of 25. There have even been studies that have been quoted where people have been talking about how the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making part of the brain, isn't fully developed until the age of 25 or 30. Do you think there's any credence to any of these arguments, any of this hesitancy against allowing those young people to take part in voting?
I think we get into a dangerous argument if we start to talk about who is capable of making an informed choice in the polling booth and who isn't. For example, a 45-year-old who has never voted in their life and says, I'm not interested in politics, don't really care about any of it, and then suddenly decides to go out and vote. Are they in a more informed position than a 16-year-old who perhaps has studied politics, perhaps is a member of their local political party? So to talk about the capability of making an informed choice is a difficult one. What's more important is that at 16, you can work, you can earn money, you're in education, you can join the army, although you won't go to the front line. You pay taxes, you can even drive some vehicles. Now, all of those things involve, to some extent, policymakers and public money, and therefore it requires some level of democratic accountability. So that's why it's important to look at 16-year-olds and say, we actually do value you as members of society. To be able to say you can't vote until you're 18 devalues them, and it invalidates them as full citizens of society.
Do you think this will be the absolute limit, Phil? I think it was 1969, there was a move from 21 down to 18. This move, it has to be said, has been spoken about for many, many years, now finally moving from 18 down to 16. I mean, will 14-year-olds get the vote at some point, or is 16 that absolute cut-off based on this idea that you, at that point, are formally contributing financially through work and other means?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of theoretical crystal ball here. It's very difficult to be able to predict what will happen in future. I think the most likely thing is that it's unlikely to come down any further than that. We only have very few examples in the world where people are able to vote at 16 at the moment. Looking at it, obviously, in some countries within the United Kingdom, as we mentioned, Scotland and Wales, and outside of the UK, two other countries in Europe, Austria and Malta, allow voting at 16, and Brazil allows that. So it's certainly contentious. It's not a popular thing, but it is. There may be. It's one of these things where you kind of have to draw the line somewhere, and although I would never say never, I think as people begin to be increasingly playing a part in civil life, working, paying taxes, being involved in the sort of things that involve public money, then that's the point at which they should have that level of say in the democracy. And so, impossible to say, but I think 16 is probably the lower limit for now.
Let's talk about the steps that we'll need to go through, that society will need to go to prepare those young people for voting. That's another area that's been hotly debated. There have been critics who've been suggesting that actually it's going to be very difficult to ensure that preparation is done completely impartially, because necessarily much of it will have to be directed by the existing government in some form. Do you think there's any validity to those concerns? What do you feel is important when it comes to that preparation role?
I think part of the preparation for the role is to increase or improve citizenship within school. Now, their citizenship has existed as a curriculum area for many years, and both governments, this government and the previous government, have both outlined areas in which they think that should be improved. So I think it would be right to be able to improve on that, to be able to have discussions about how individuals can contribute to part of community and as a society, and the roles that they can play, and how the individual choices we make on a daily basis can actually affect the broader picture. So I would say that one of the biggest areas in terms of preparing people for that is education, and particularly towards the issue towards citizenship.
Phil, finally, you touched on this, that actually there are very few countries that have taken this step to lower the voting age to 16. Do you think this might encourage others to follow suit? Will other countries be looking at this almost as a test case?
I'm sure they will be, yes, to be able to see how well it works. And indeed, they already have done that. But then again, you look at history with that. You've seen how history throughout various countries in the world has evolved in terms of increasing the amount of people that it would allow to take part in the democratic process. And, one country would have looked to another when women were allowed to vote. Prior to that, they would have looked from one country to another to see, is it effective that we should give working class people a vote, for example, rather than just people who have land and property. So, of course, people will look towards the effectiveness of this. And I would certainly expect there to be some changes across Europe. But the most important thing is to be able to say, so long as people are engaging with the democratic process, and so long as politicians, as leaders, as would-be leaders, are engaging with youth and doing policies which will be relevant and important to young people, then they will begin to engage in their own right, and they will certainly be considered within the democratic process.
Phil, it's always great to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts with us on Newshour. Now, staying with the UK, moving to Oxford, and we're going to speak to the political analyst Tim Wilson. Tim, great to see you. Thanks for joining us on Newshour. Let's get into this then. Very interesting. Lots of disagreement, lots of polarised debate about this. What do you think about this idea of this being really about democracy, making sure that everybody has access to voting, the spirit, the principle of democracy, versus an argument that says, well, hang on, this group overwhelmingly tends to vote for one particular party?
Well, that's what we've always been told. We've always been told that younger people tend to vote for the Labour Party, so it should be a sure bet if the Labour Party is going to bring in a lowering of the age of voting, that they're going to get those votes. I think Phil is absolutely right that this is now more confused because of the rise of Jeremy Corbyn on the one hand and his planned party, and the rise of the monumental rise of Reform on the other hand. What I think we can say is that this is still a completely cynical operation, cynical and symbolic, because the one party that will not benefit from this lowering of the age of voting is the Conservative Party. And given the problems of the Conservative Party, exacerbated by its current leader and her inability to manage parliamentary questions on a Wednesday, I think this is quite definitely the death knell. It's quite definitely the coup de grace of the Conservative Party. This will destroy the Conservative Party's chances in the next election. So at the next election, maybe Labour will not benefit greatly from the votes of the 16 and 17-year-olds, but the Conservative Party definitely will not benefit from that. I think that's the point.
You think this could really be the beginning of the end of the Conservative Party as we know it? I mean, it's an interesting point.
Oh, I think the beginning of the, yes.
Because
I think the beginning of the end has already started.
There's so much polarisation. There's polarisation in politics anyway. at the moment. It's exacerbated by social media, where both Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage are performing particularly well. Kemi Badenoch struggling to make her voice heard anyway. I mean, there's a certain logic to what you say, that actually this will become near impossible for her now to have her voice heard.
Yes, well, first of all, she hasn't made up her mind what she wants to say. She has no policies as such. She's waiting to see what the policies will be. Well, that's no good as leader of the opposition. And with a very poor opposition, the government tends to flounder, and it creates its own opposition in its own backbenches. And that's what we saw in the welfare vote, where backbenchers voted against and rebelled against the government. And now Keir Starmer has removed the whip from 5 backbenchers as punishment, I suppose, for that, for defying his authority. But that is a natural consequence of the failure of the opposition, and I think this will complete. There is nobody. There's no clear successor to Kemi Badenoch, and so I think as the Conservative Party lurches further to the right, it may simply become indistinguishable from Reform UK, or it may go into complete extinction. As for the voting rights, Phil put out a number of points. He said the things that a 16-year-old can do, but there are many things a 16-year-old cannot do. A 16-year-old cannot buy alcohol. Not that you need to buy alcohol in order to vote, but a 16-year-old cannot serve on a jury. A 16-year-old, as you pointed out, cannot stand as an MP. So that means we're giving the vote to 16-year-olds who don't actually have full legal capacity in Britain. That seems a very odd move. We need to increase 16-year-olds' legal capacity at the same time as giving them the vote. Then perhaps it would be slightly less cynical, but I think there's no way that the opposition could possibly stop this move, even if they wanted to, even if they had that capacity. I also think that it's defended by the idea of democracy. This isn't something that can be attacked. It's an inevitable. There is an inevitability about this move.
And Tim, do you think, is it too soon to have a clear view on how well this move has gone in Scotland and Wales? Have we got any data, even anecdotally, about how the good and the bad side of this move?
I don't have the data, but I know anecdotally that the Scottish independence vote was heavily helped by the 16-year-old vote. I don't know terribly about Wales. It's odd because I lived there for a while, but I know that young people in schools in Wales are very engaged in the political process, but I don't know beyond that point.
I spoke to Phil about the role of schools and education, and we were discussing this idea that potentially there could be some risk factors there. There have been views on both sides with regards to schools and preparing young people to vote. Do you think there's any danger that we move into a state of affairs where schools can almost become campaigning grounds for political parties?
The schools are campaigning grounds for political parties. Politicians like to visit schools in the hope, really, of encouraging children's parents to vote, and so this will be nothing new. It will just simply be that the people that they're visiting will actually have a vote that they can use. I think it will be I think the practicality of it will be fascinating. I think we will likely see schools laying on buses to take students to the voting booths, and I think schools will be significantly more involved in this process. Already in schools, in both GCSEs and certainly in A-levels, politics is a major subject. Students are often studying this. They know more about politics than many adults, and I think it would be insulting to suggest that students who are only 16 years old are going to be voting emotionally rather than rationally. Most people vote emotionally, and also just down the road from here in Warwickshire County Council, that county council is now run by an 18-year-old. So the idea about the brain development and about young people not reaching mental maturity until they're about 25 or 26 or 29. This is absurd. We've already got an 18-year-old controlling a council.
Is he doing a good job,
that's
Tim?
somebody by default.
Is he doing a good job?
Probably not, but he's a member of Reform UK. So I think the answer is based on the colour of his political allegiance rather than his age. But I think I don't see any reason why somebody who is 18 or 16 cannot be as engaged in the political debate as somebody who is 75 or 80 or 45. I don't think we should be defining political understanding by age. I think we should be defining it by engagement. And if somebody is capable of being put into the military, albeit with parental support, then I think they're capable of being able to vote. And I think we have to recognise, rather like Brexit, that this is an inevitability, and find and look at the best. And I look at young people as a teacher all the time, and I think actually you are cleverer than I was at your age, and you have opinions, and it's going to fortify the debate. I think that's exciting.
And a question that I put to Phil was, will 16 be the final point? Will it ever go any further? Will 14-year-olds or 12-year-olds ever, in the near future, be invited to vote? What's your perspective on that?
I think it could go down a little lower, actually. I think young people are always surprising. I have a lot of confidence in young people. I think I've taught children from every single age group, and these days I'm always slightly perplexed as to how old somebody is when they're sitting in front of me, and I'm always slightly surprised when they say, "Oh, I'm in year 3," and I think, "Oh my goodness, I thought you were doing GCSEs." They seem very bright, very turned on, very clever, and very well informed, better informed than many adults. And I would trust the decision of a 14-year-old, certainly, and I would definitely trust the decision. I would seek the opinion of a 16-year-old and certainly an 18-year-old. My concerns are that the other legal capacity isn't there, and that needs to be pulled up so that they have an opportunity to sit on a jury, and they need to take responsibility for their actions. If they're going to take responsibility for the direction of our country, they must take responsibility for their personal actions. And I think I think at the age of 16 you can also change your name. There's so many things you can do at the age of 16. Vote, I think, should be one of those things. If we can rebuild trust in democracy in youth, then maybe we can keep that trust in democracy as people get older, because at the moment that trust is broken, and maybe we need to see more younger people getting into parliament. We need to see a more youthful parliament, and less of the hangers-on who only know a life in politics. We need to see a full range of people, men, women, younger people, older people, representing us in the parliamentary chamber in the House of Commons.
So we should have more trust in young people, in those leaders of the future.
Oh, I think fundamentally, the future is in the hands of young people, and we need to we need to project our trust in them. It may be a sort of proleptic thing, but the more I find, the more you trust young people, the more they rise to the occasion. So I think it's a positive thing. I don't think that the Labour Party is necessarily going to get those votes, and we saw across in America how Trump was greatly helped by the votes of the youth vote, particularly the male youth vote, and I think a lot of that younger male youth vote will go over to Reform, and some of it will go over to Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think it's assured to go over to Labour at all, but it is definitely certain that it won't go over to Kemi Badenoch or to the Conservatives, unless there is the most astonishingly charismatic figure who is chosen to replace Kemi Badenoch. I think because of the engagement with social media, the youth vote is particularly capable of being swayed by a clever, engaging, dynamic, theatrical politician. We don't have one of those in either the Labour Party or in the Conservative Party at the moment. As far as I can see, the only one that exists is Nigel Farage.
Very interesting. Tim, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for joining us from Oxford in the UK. Well, that is all for this edition of Newshour. From policy to politics, Britain's bold decision to enfranchise 16-year-olds has ignited fierce debate. Whether it strengthens democracy or sows division remains to be seen. From all of us here at A News, thanks for being with us.